Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Mike Delaney. I'm a partner in the employment team at VWV, and I'm also head of the recruitment sector. This morning, I'm going to talk to you about the IR35 updates that came into effect on the 6th of April this year, and I'll be looking at how the changes impact hirers, particularly those organisations who are contracting with individuals who are using their personal service company, and also as well looking at the problems and issues that face contractors, again, post 6th of April. We have a wide, diverse audience today, particularly from education, higher education. There are a lot of commercial firms, recruitment firms, individual contractors as well. So there is actually quite a broad range of people listening in. So if I can turn, Amy, first slide, please. Right, so what I'm going to cover this morning is essentially a recap of what IR35 is, and I'm sure most of you who are listening in will already be aware of what IR35 is, but perhaps there are some that don't. What has changed, and also, again, as I was saying, the position and how the consequences and impact affect both the clients as the hirer of contractors and also the contractors themselves. Next slide, please. So just to recap, what is IR35? Well, IR35 applies when an individual contracts through their personal service company or other intermediary, and that intermediary enters into a contract with a client. And the issue in reality is whether or not the individual who is performing the services through their intermediary is in fact, in reality, an employee of the client. And for these purposes, an intermediary is normally a personal service company that's used by an individual, but it can also be a partnership, an LLP, or indeed an individual. And again, as I'm sure you're all aware, that certainly pre-6th of April of this year, under the arrangements that were in place at that time, you had a scenario where a client would enter into a contract with the personal service company, and at the end of the assignment or the project, the personal service company would account to HMRC for the tax as provided in the slide. Next slide, please. So here you've got a standard three-party chain labour supply. You have the client at the top of the labour supply, you have the contract with the personal service company, and then obviously the arrangements between the personal service company and the individual contractor. So what's changed since the 6th of April? Well, since the 6th of April, the client or the hirer has now got to determine whether or not the relationship that it's entering into with the personal service company is in fact caught by IR35. And if the arrangement or the assignment is so caught, then it's going to be the client who's now going to be responsible for not only determining whether IR35 applies, but if it does so, then it has the obligation to account to HMRC for the taxes as opposed to the personal service company. Next slide, please. So again, here you can see from this slide that under the new arrangements post 6th of April, it is the client that is accounting to HMRC for the taxes or the employment taxes on the basis that it's carried out a status determination statement and has deemed that the arrangement is caught by IR35. Next slide, please. So how do the new rules apply to you in the private sector? So if you are a hirer and you're not a small company, and indeed, if your turnover exceeds 10.2 million, or your balance sheet assets exceed 5.1 million, or indeed you have more than 50 employees, if two of those three criteria apply to you, then post 6th of April, as an organisation, you are deemed to undertake a status determination statement in relation to any contractors that you are hiring through their personal service company. For the avoidance of doubt, if your organisation is part of a group, then HMRC will be looking at the size of the group and looking at worldwide turnover and also balance sheet asset value worldwide. So you can't just set up a company for the purposes of hiring contractors on the basis that your assets are minimal. The obligation will be that if you are a hirer and you're not a small company, then you will have to determine the status with the individual, and in particular, whether employment taxes have to be accounted to the revenue by you. If you are a small company and you don't fall within this criteria, then the old arrangements will continue to apply. Next slide, please. We do have listening in, I'm aware, some local authorities as well. Certainly local authorities will be aware that with effect from the 6th of April 2017, they should have been making status determination statements in relation to contracting from that time and working through the various criteria and guidance to determine whether or not an individual and their personal service company is caught by the off-payroll regulations. One other point to note as well, particularly from the 6th of April 2021, and we have some healthcare organisations listening in as well, that entities supplying healthcare services, so in other words, you have, for example, a company that's supplying maybe clinical pharmacists or other organisations, that if the size of those companies are such, again, that they're not a small company, then again, those organisations will need to consider making a status determination statement. Previously, before 6th of April, they were exempt. Next slide, please. And also in terms of what are the future developments? Well, I've set out on this slide details of an all-parliamentary working group that made a report in April 2020. And again, this is sitting with the government to decide how or if they're going to action any of the issues that have actually been raised by the report. And in particular, it's suggested that the government should carry out a review and also investigate the best way of structuring, remunerating and taxing contractors and freelancers as well. And also as well, the government should also legislate to ensure that anyone who is taxed as an employee should receive employee benefits, because at the moment, and again, I'll explain later on, that if as a contractor, the hirer has deemed the arrangement to be caught by IR35 and employment taxes are deducted by the hirer, you as a contractor will be deemed to be an employee of your personal service company, and you won't be entitled to receive any benefits or other rights against the hirer. Next slide, please. So again, the report also commented, particularly with the use of umbrella companies. Certainly I've noticed in the contracting market as well, where individuals are deemed to be within IR35, then some individuals are now, rather than operating through their personal service companies, are operating through umbrella companies. And again, the all-parliamentary report suggests that there needs to be better regulation as to how these umbrella companies are run. And also the final point on the slide, simplification of the UK tax system. So again, food for thought there, and we await further developments in due course. Next slide, please. So what criteria do you as hirers need to consider when making a status determination assessment? Next slide. Now I've set out in the next couple of slides the various criteria that organisations, hirers need to consider. And the criteria is essentially based on employment status cases, employment tax status cases, and also guidance from HMRC. So the starting point, if you are a hirer and you are obliged to determine the status of the arrangement with the contractor and the personal service company, the starting point must be for there to be check for the employment status test. So this is an online HMRC tool, which can be used anonymously by hirers and contractors alike. And what you need to do is obviously to complete that online tool by feeding in all the relevant information in response to a series of questions. And provided the person making the test makes full disclosure and doesn't try to conceal facts, then HMRC will have generally said that they will be bound by their status determination. But it does require the person who's inputting all information to make full disclosure. And if you hadn't made full disclosure, then HMRC essentially won't be bound. But there are a number of questions, again, within that status tool that could actually cause individuals or hirers alike some difficulty in actually achieving the result that they want. The other point as well to note that you can have situations where you might actually get two results. I had a case there recently where I was advising a hirer that was actually part of a public body, and they had wanted to hire a contractor to carry out a series of training over the course of a year, and the trainer or the contractor would be paid a daily rate, and they were contracting through their service company. Now, when the contractor undertook the check for employment status test, they got back a response from HMRC to the effect that the arrangement was not caught. But when the hirer did it, the information or the decision they got back was that the decision was not determinable. So in other words, you had two potentially conflicting decisions. So what did the hirer do in those circumstances? It applied a series of additional criteria, which I'm going to go through now, in order to make their status determination statement. And they came to a decision that after they had undertaken all of the criteria, that the proposed assignment with this contractor was outside IR35. But because of the exercise they went through, if ultimately someone looks into the various payments that are made to this contractor, at least the hirer will be able to show that they have actually acted in a very diligent and taken all reasonable care in arriving at their decision. Next slide, please. So what should you be doing as hirers? Obviously, examine your own business operation. Is it the sort of business that lends itself to hiring contractors? What's the nature of the business? But also as well, if you're hiring a contractor, but you already have employees undertaking similar roles within your organization, what is the justification for hiring a contractor through their own personal service company? And I think this boils down to the nature of the proposed assignment. It may well be that it's short term, for example. But again, HMRC will look where you have similar people already employed as to why you're not employing the contractor, even if it is only on a fixed term basis. And also as well, if you do have individuals already performing services that are similar to the services that are going to be provided by the contractor, again, are there any differences in terms? But I think in most situations, hirers will be able to demonstrate that the reason for contracting, it might be that there's a particular project that's short term that justifies, for example, hiring a contractor rather than employing the individual, particularly if there's a degree of autonomy on the part of the contractor who can control the way in which the project is handled, etc. Next slide, please. So again, other criteria set out on this slide is generated from the various HMRC guidance. The last guidance, major guidance, was updated 12th of November. And also the guidance makes clear that when hirers are undertaking these status determination statements, they've got to act in a way that a prudent and reasonable person in the hirer's position would act. So ignorance of the law is certainly no defence, and bearing in mind the obligation is on larger companies. So HMRC assume that they will have the resources to actually undertake this exercise properly. Also, as well, one of the factors as well that has to be taken into account is whether a contractor has previously been employed by a higher organisation, and all of a sudden then they change their status to one of contracting or contracting through their personal service company, and HMRC will again want to know the reasons for that if that particular assignment is investigated. Next slide. So other obligations, there is a positive obligation as well on the part of the hirer to seek professional advice. As I was saying earlier, ignorance of the law is no defence. And also as well, the guidance ESM, which is the Employment Status Manual 502, makes it clear that issues such as control over a contractor, the way they're supervised and managed, are relevant factors that need to be taken into account for the purpose of determining whether or not, in reality, the individual employee contractor is in fact an employee for employment tax purposes of the organisation. Also as well, consider any relevant codes, regulations, particular to your sector. So another factor as well is considering what type of work is to be done, who decides what work is to be done, what tasks are to be performed. And generally speaking, the assignment will be subject to a written document which should set out that information. Next slide. So again, other considerations that need to be taken into account when you are determining whether the individual is an employee for employment tax purposes. Who decides what work has to be done? Are there set hours? Is there any flexibility? How are holiday absences or other illness absences to be covered? When is the work to be done? Where is it to be done? Is it at the company's offices? Is it remotely? Are there rights of substitution? Who's responsible for the performance of the substitute and who pays the substitute? These are all criteria that need to be taken into account, because again, it goes towards control and supervision over the contractor. If there is rigid control and supervision over the contractor in the way that they perform the services, then in reality, you are getting into the realms of employment rather than self-employment. Next slide, please. So other criteria as well that needs to be taken into account: who provides the equipment? What equipment is being used? In many situations, if it's in the field of IT, it may be that only a laptop is required. If there is other equipment, who pays the cost? Who pays the upkeep of running costs of such equipment? I mean, generally speaking, again, depending on the nature of the assignment, that it's the contractor really, or the personal service company, that should be providing the equipment. Also as well, look at how you're structuring the payments to the personal service company stroke individual. And again, what I suggest in many cases, that contractors should be rewarded in relation to milestones that are achieved during a particular project. And time again, I come across situations where the contractor is paid a daily rate. There are no milestones, there are no targets. The assignments can be long-term, and indeed at the moment, I'm being asked to advise on an assignment which potentially has the ability to last for 5 years with a 12-month notice period. Again, in my view, that smacks of employment rather than self-employment. So there needs to be introduced into the arrangement an element of risk, because at the end of the day, the contractor is or should be running their own business. So again, when you're structuring payments, do introduce the financial risk. So if, for example, the contractor doesn't hit the target, it may be that either there's a payment that's affected or the payment is delayed. So there is an element of risk that's being introduced into the arrangement. Expenses, again, generally shouldn't be paid to contractors, I guess, unless they are exceptional. If you want a contractor maybe to take a flight overseas and stay in hotel accommodation, then those expenses, I think, should be agreed at the outset and factored into the contractor's quote. Because, again, expenses paid generally point towards employment. Next slide, please. So other factors, mutuality of obligation. So if there is if there are rigid obligations on the part of the contractor, i.e., to attend the workplace every day or to log on every day between fixed hours, then you're into, again, the realms of employment. I mean, the key ingredient in an employment relationship is one of mutuality of obligation. So there is an obligation on both parties to turn up for work on a regular basis. Exclusivity as well. Can the contractor work elsewhere whilst they're performing services for you? One other key issue as well is whether the contractor is held out as part and parcel of the hire organisation. So the contractor sits within your organisation. You give that person a company email address and maybe company telephone number. And to the outside world or a third party, it would appear that that contractor is part and parcel of your organisation. That's something, again, that HMRC look at, as well as the length of the assignment as well. And as I was just saying, an assignment that has the potential to last 5 years, I do query whether or not that is really one of self-employment, because, again, on the face of it, there's very little risk and there's guaranteed work for the contractor for many years. There also needs as well, again, to be built into any commercial arrangement, a right to terminate the assignment on reasonable notice, again, depending on what's involved. Next slide, please. So again, as I was saying earlier, when you as hirers are making these status determination assessments, you need to act in a way that would be expected to be as a reasonable and prudent person in a hirer's position. So again, taking into account all of the factors that I've just outlined. And again, as I was saying earlier, there is a higher burden placed on you as organizations because you are deemed to be large companies with resources. But also as well, the statement determination must be complete and thorough, and it must be undertaken by someone who is very familiar with the project or the assignment, and they are able to answer honestly all of the criteria that we've just outlined, and also deal with any assessed HMRC tool as well. Because if the person who's making the assessment isn't aware of all of the factors, then that in itself will lead to a dispute and possibly grounds of appeal by the contractor. So, for example, if you as a hirer decide that 50% of your contractors are from a particular moment in time no longer going to be treated as outside IR35, but going to be caught by IR35, whereas the other 50% are outside IR35, again, can it reasonably be said that you as an organisation have taken reasonable care in making that assessment? And again, the guidance makes clear that hirers who essentially opt to decide that all contractors are caught by IR35 will not be taking reasonable care when carrying out these status determination assessments. Next slide, please. So again, the 5 key steps that you need to take as a hirer when you are undertaking these status determination statements. Firstly, complete the online HMRC assessed tool. Consider the various guidance that I've been referring to over the last few minutes. Seek professional advice either from your lawyer or your accountant if you're in any doubt. And also, again, as I was saying earlier, the person making the assessment does have to have a complete knowledge of the assignment and the decision-making process, and to be able to justify why they have made a particular decision, particularly if the assignment is caught by IR35. But also, as well as hirers, be prepared to review processes on an ongoing basis. It may well be that the nature of the assignment changes, and that might lead you to having to review the status again. Next slide, please. So hirers get to a position where you've undertaken your status determination statement, you have reported the outcome to the contractor with your reasons, and you've undertaken reasonable care. So that's the position that you want to get to. Next slide. So if there is a dispute about the status determination statement, i.e. that the hirer has decided that the arrangement is caught by IR35, then obviously the contractor or the personal service company has a right of appeal within 45 days of that decision. The hirer is obliged to reconsider its decision with reasons. But once the hirer has further determined the decision, there's no further right of appeal as far as a contractor is concerned to a civil court. And once the hirer has made that decision that the assignment is caught, then it's going to be obliged to start deducting employment taxes. So that's going to be income tax, national insurance contributions, both employer and employee, and as well as any apprenticeship levy that might be applicable as well. And the difficulty for the contractor in those circumstances is that because it has no further right of appeal to a county court or a high court, then all the contractor can do is either stop working or potentially challenge your assessment when they file their own tax returns. But that, of course, could be a very difficult exercise to persuade HMRC that the hirer had got it wrong. Next slide, please. So if you as a hirer have made a status determination statement deeming that the arrangement is caught for employment tax purposes, then you as the client hirer are, for the purposes of the regulations, the deemed employer, and the obligation is on you to make the deductions. If you as a client hirer are using a recruitment agency or an employment business who's providing you with a temp contractor who's contracting through their personal service company, but in those situations, it'll be the agency that's actually paying the personal service company. What you as the hirer need to do, that if you, when you've carried out your status determination statement, deem the assignment to be caught, then you are obliged to report that also to the recruitment agency, because then it's the recruitment agency as the payer will be deemed to make the deductions. But if you don't communicate your status determination statement down the line where third parties are involved in the supply chain, such as recruitment agencies, then the liability for the payment of any taxes, if they are due, will remain with you as the client hirer. Next slide. So again, as I was just saying, you can see on this particular slide where you have a number of recruitment agencies involved in the supply chain. You might, as a hirer, have contracted with an agency to provide you with a specialist contractor. They might then have subcontracted the arrangement to agency number 2 or 3. But again, what needs to be clear is that each agency involved in the supply chain needs to communicate that status determination statement down the chain, and the agency who doesn't pass on that status determination statement is going to continue to be responsible for the payment of employment taxes. Next slide, please. So overseas clients as well. So if you are an overseas hirer, then you're not going to be caught by these off-payroll regulations. So, but you could have a situation where the parent company might be overseas, but the actual client hirer is based in the UK. And in that scenario, then the UK entity will be caught. And remember what I was saying earlier, again, if there are overseas and group company structures involved, HMRC will look at the global structure for the purposes of determining your turnover, balance sheet, assets, etc. Next slide, please. So again, what I was talking about earlier, if there is a disagreement over your status determination statement, you must build into any process with your contractor a disagreement process, allowing the contractor a right of appeal. Next slide, please. Right, so let's have a look then from the position of the contractor. So the contractor's obligations then, are you really in business on your own account? What's the nature of your business? What financial risk are you running as a contractor, or is your business running? Have you invested any capital or other expenditure into your business? Is there a possibility of making a loss? Do you carry insurance? Because again, something I've been asked to look at the moment, the contractor doesn't want to provide insurance. So that can be a difficult issue. And time again, I see situations, particularly those working in IT, they are turning up for work or logging on a regular basis, carrying out assignments. And you must ask yourself, where is the financial risk to you, particularly if you are, as is traditional, getting paid a daily rate for turning up, and you're not responsible for any overrun, for example, on a project, or you're not penalized if you don't hit targets or milestones. So that's the approach sometimes that HMRC will be looking at if indeed it starts to challenge or look into your affairs. Next slide, please. As I was saying earlier, again, if you are a contractor and you're genuinely running your own business, then you should be paying your own expenses and factoring in any expenses into your fee quotes. Do you have any influence over the rates of pay? Now, I am aware that there are obviously a number of contractors who are highly specialized in their field and do command premium rates, particularly if, for example, in the pharmaceutical and life sciences sector, where we have quite a large presence at VWV, there are contractors who provide services, particularly running clinical trials. And those individuals, those responsible persons, are very sought after. They are highly regulated, and they can command premium rates for their services. Also, again, just generally looking at the nature of the assignment, is it casual, short-term, or long-term? And as I was saying earlier, an assignment which has the potential to last 5 years, you have to query again, where is the financial risk? Does the personal service company have other clients? If you are in business on your own account, you should, where possible, be or have a client base that is providing you with different streams of income. If you are solely working for one particular hirer and do so on a long-term basis, and you don't have any other income from any other sources, again, HMRC may question that. But also, again, if you are a contractor, also do the online assess tool and make full disclosure when you're doing it. And that will also, as well, if you get the result you want, that the proposed assignment is not caught by IR35, then you as a contractor at least have something to argue with if the hirer comes to a different view. Next slide, please. So if you are a contractor, or indeed a hirer as well, I've set out on this slide the basis of a commercial contract so as to try and demonstrate to HMRC, if the arrangement is challenged, that this arrangement between the hirer and the personal service company is a commercial contract. It's not an employment contract. And what you need to do, again, define what the contractor's obligations are under the contract, what the deliverables are, what the outcomes. Are there timelines? Are there penalties going to be introduced or payments delayed if certain milestones are not hit? Just shows to demonstrate financial risk, which you would have in a genuine commercial arrangement. And also as well, give the contractor, as far as possible, some freedom so as to be able to operate the assignment without constant supervision, direction and control from the hirer. Include a substitution clause. But again, I've seen certainly over the years where substitution clauses are included in commercial agreements, but in reality, the substitute is not allowed. And HMRC, again, will be alive to that factor, such as who are your substitutes, what's their availability? Would the client hirer ever agree to a substitute being put in post in any event? And as I was saying earlier about someone who's running a clinical trial, these people are so specialized, it's very unlikely that a large drugs company would ever allow a substitute unless they had approved that, and that substitute again had the relevant qualifications. Again, define where the services are to be delivered, whether they're on-site, off-site, maybe there's a mixture of both. And again, the final point, again, as I was saying, and I can't emphasize enough, do introduce timelines for the project, don't leave it open-ended, introduce targets, phases, and link those to the payments. Next slide, please. So again, as I was saying earlier, it's a little bit repetitive of what I've been saying. Again, introduce targets, make the contractor responsible for any losses, contractors to provide their own equipment, introduce flexibility so that you get away from being accused by HMRC of being under supervision, direction and control of the hirer. And also, again, if you're a contractor, try and make sure that you are actually providing other services to more than one client. Next slide, please. So again, I was saying earlier, if you as a contractor are unhappy with the status determination statement, then I've set out on this particular slide possible grounds of appeal. And one of the main grounds of appeal that I've actually used to help contractors is that the person making the decision hasn't taken reasonable care and doesn't necessarily know what the contractor has actually done. And this particularly applies with large organizations who, because of risk associated as a result of being potentially liable for paying employment taxes, have taken decisions, blanket decisions, to deem that arrangements are now caught when before 6th of April they weren't caught. You can challenge that approach on the basis that the person making the decision really doesn't know what's involved. So, and also as well, failure to complete accurately the HMRC tool. So again, those are potential grounds that contractors can use when appealing these status determination statements. Next slide, please. So again, I've set out on this slide other, grounds of appeal as well, that contractors regularly use. Failure by the hirer to apply the relevant HMRC guidance that I've referred to, person not having the requisite knowledge, And again, the hirer must reconsider their decision within 45 days. Now, one of the other problems for contractors is that if the hirer comes to a decision first time round that the assignment is caught by IR35, then from that point onwards, it must start deducting employment taxes, even though there might be an appeal pending, and the hirer might take 45 days in which to determine that appeal. So during the appeal process, HMRC have advised hirers that they need to be deducting employment taxes. Now, this might cause some cash flow or other difficulty or issues for contractors, particularly whilst an appeal is pending. And I suppose as a contractor as well, you need to ask yourself if the status determination assessment has been made not in your favour and has deemed the arrangement to be caught by IR35, what is the possibility, particularly of large organisations reversing their decision, bearing in mind the risk falls with them if indeed they've got it wrong. So as a contractor, what are your remedies? You need to look at the terms of your contract with the hirer, and in particular, whether or not you make a decision that you're not going to continue providing services. If you're indeed able to do so, you might be able to withdraw your labour, again, subject to any terms that you've agreed. And as I was saying earlier, you have no rights of appeal against the status determination statement, and all you can do is challenge your assessment through your tax return, which again is not really going to be an ideal situation, unless you can show that the hirer has got it completely wrong. Next slide, please. So to round off, I'm just going to deal with some reported cases that actually have been reported, particularly from the civil courts and the tax tribunals. I've done this talk on a number of occasions, and a frequent question that I get asked, particularly those involved in education, higher education, etc., they ask me, well, what cases are there that's applicable to their sector? Well, the answer is there aren't any that I can find. And what I've done is essentially selected what I consider to be important cases from important sectors. But as far as I'm aware, there are no reported. That's not to say there aren't, but I can't find any that actually deal with schools, academies, and universities, all of whom now are beginning to engage individuals through personal service companies. For example, universities are engaging lecturers more on a freelance basis through a contractor type arrangement, as are schools who might be hiring, for example, a PE teacher who might be providing services to one school one day and a different school another day, etc. So employment status and contracting is very popular, but also because of the tightening up of the arrangements post 6th of April, then there are risks that need to be considered. But going back to this particular slide, there is no statutory test to determine whether an individual is an employee or not. And status, employment status or worker status or self-employed status are determined by case law. There's also relevant HMRC guidance as well that needs to be taken into account. But obviously status is critical for the purposes of IR35, because if the contractor is deemed to be an employee of the hirer, then although he will get no rights, employment rights against the hirer, he would have to be subjected to the deduction of both employer and employee national insurance contributions, any apprenticeship levy, as well as the income tax as well. So that contractor is very much in a worse position than they would be if indeed they had taken some short-term employment. Next slide, please. So these are the cases that I've selected for today. The first one, AutoCleanse Limited. It's a case, the Supreme Court 2011. And it's a case that is always used by HMRC. In AutoCleanse, what had actually happened was that you had a group of workers who were essentially cleaning cars for car valeting for an organisation, and they brought claims in the employment tribunal for holiday pay, etc. And there was an issue as to whether they were workers or employees. But whilst that's not particularly important, what the Supreme Court said is that employment tribunals, tax tribunals, civil courts have the power to look behind well-drawn documentation that sets out the arrangements between hire organisations and individuals and their personal service companies. So if HMRC want to challenge an assignment and is attacking either the hirer or indeed the contractor, they might use AutoCleanse, or probably will use AutoCleanse, if they're looking at your contractual relationships and argue that whilst the contract says one thing, what's actually happening on the ground or by way of operation is something entirely different. So AutoCleanse is a case that's genuinely relied upon by the revenue. So the next couple of cases, HMRC, Athol House Productions and Krista Ackroyd Media, involve essentially presenters who work for the BBC as individuals. They're broadcasters. And in Athol House Productions, it was actually held that the broadcaster there was not an employee of the BBC, generally because they didn't have access to the BBC's facilities. They weren't subjected to line management, although it was accepted that the BBC had editorial control over the way in which the individual was broadcasting. But similar facts arose in the Krista Ackroyd case as well. But in that case, she was held to be an employee for tax purposes. So you had similar facts in both Athol House and Ackroyd, but they came to different decisions. Dillon and Dillon were brothers, and that they were drivers. They used to drive for one particular organisation, and they got paid a standard shift fee. They didn't undertake any work for any other engager, and it was held that their relationship was caught by IR35 for employment tax purposes. Mantides is a healthcare case. George Mantides was or is a urology surgeon, and he had two contracts, one with the NHS and another contract where he provided his consultancy services through a limited company. His tax affairs were investigated. It was held that the NHS contract, he was an employee and subject to PAYE. But as far as his other contract was concerned, because he was subject essentially to the hospital control in the way in which he provided his services, and indeed subject to professional and regulatory compliance, but also as well had to ask for time when he was wanted to be away for holidays, etc. And also because he worked something like 5 half days a week providing services, that arrangement was held to be caught by IR35. Phillips is another, what I would call more typical sort of case. Phillips was an insurance broker, and he was essentially paid on commission base only. And he essentially got rewarded through his own network of contacts. So he controlled as well his working hours. He worked from home. He had his own insurance contacts. He didn't report to anyone within the organization. He was essentially paid by virtue of a success rate. And also he had certain intellectual property rights in the services that he was providing. And in that case, it was held that he was a genuinely self-employed person. Interestingly, the dispute arose over whether or not he was in fact an employee of the organisation. But for employment tax purposes, he was held to be an employee. So next slide, please. So the themes, I think, that arise from these cases as well are just set out on that slide. So you have broadcasters where there is mutuality of obligation. You have the drivers, you have the surgeon, all obliged to carry out services in a particular way. There's a degree of control, particularly exercised in healthcare and also in broadcasting. Also, as well, in all of these cases, apart from Philips, the individuals got paid a fixed amount. So there was a fixed amount if the broadcaster did a particular show, whether it was on TV or radio. The drivers got a fixed fee, the surgeon got a fixed fee as well, unlike Philips, who was rewarded differently. And the length of engagements in all those cases was considerable. In the broadcasting cases in Athol House, I think the individual had to dedicate something like 200 days a year. And in the Ackroyd case, I think it was about 160 days a year that they had to guarantee to the broadcaster. The presence or lack of benefits did actually have an impact in the Athol House case, but doesn't seem to have been taken into account in the other decisions that I've mentioned. So I think, again, if you are a contractor and you are facing a HMRC investigation, you need really to be able to demonstrate that you are genuinely a business operating on your own account, that you're not subject to supervision and direction and control. You can provide the services on a flexible basis, that there is an element of risk and maybe uncertainty in terms of the way in which you get remunerated. So that's really all I have to say. There are some Q&A questions. So someone's asked, in terms of recruitment agency, confirm they're liable for the tax of the worker they're sending to us. Do we have to do the CEST if the recruit? So I'm not quite sure, but the point is this: if you are a hirer and you are not a small company, then irrespective of whether or not a recruitment agency says they're going to pay taxes, you are obliged to undertake the status determination statement and communicate that decision to the recruitment agency. And if you don't do that, then potentially if there's a problem further down the line, then there might be a problem. But even if the recruitment agency agrees to pick up the taxes, again, I think you need to be careful because if that recruitment agency goes bust because there's a huge tax bill to pay, then again, you don't want that issue of tax knocking on your door. So next question: if the contractor is based and providing services outside the UK, Ireland, are they caught by the legislation, but it's a UK hirer? Again, as I was saying earlier, overseas hirers are essentially exempt. But if you're a UK hirer, then you should be carrying out the assessment. But the reality, I think, of the situation is that the contractor in another jurisdiction will probably be paying taxes in another jurisdiction rather than the UK. I would say probably on balance, the obligation is for the UK hirer to carry out the status determination, but that the taxes are not being paid in the UK elsewhere. I think that maybe I need to get back to you on that one. Someone else says we use agencies to supply cover teachers. What are our obligations? Again, if you are, again, you don't say what school you are, but if you are an independent school, for example, and you're a charity and your assets and turnover are below the 10.2 million, 5 million, then again, you won't need to carry out the status determination. If, on the other hand, you're an academy and can be deemed to be supplying public authority services, then indeed you will need to carry out the status determination statement. Someone else asked, should a contractor share their test results with the hirer? I don't think there's any problem with that at all, particularly if there is some doubt as to the status of the assignment. And as I was saying earlier, I did have to deal with a situation there recently where there were two conflicting CEST results that were generated from HMRC. So someone else has asked, we're a small consultancy firm. We have a combination of employees and contractors. Our contractors have agreements in place with our company. Does the small company exemption apply to our company? Again, I suppose that what's relevant is the nature of the contract, the nature of the assignment that is actually being undertaken. So if you have a commercial contract between a hirer and a consultancy firm, and the consultancy firm is providing services rather than people, then again, I would suggest that IR35 doesn't apply in that scenario. Someone else has asked about locum GPs as contractors and GP practices as hirers. Again, if you're a GP practice, you're carrying out public authority function, again, you should be looking at undertaking a status determination statement. And looking at the case of Mantides, again, I think you need to be careful in how you engage locum GPs. So someone else asked, during a status appeal, can you ask not to be paid to avoid deduction of taxes? As I was saying earlier, the HMRC guidance to hirers essentially advises the hirer, if they've made a status determination statement to the effect that that the assignment is caught by IR35, then again, the advice is that they need to be making deductions immediately, even though there is an appeal pending. And if they don't, then the hirer ultimately could be responsible if they don't make those deductions. Someone else has asked, so an individual, I presume, is a contractor who's won her appeal against IR35, and they work for 10 different employers, presumably companies, clients. One company I work for has put a limit of 100 days work a year, and then they will start presumably deducting PAYE. Again, all I would say is that you've got to look at the nature of the assignment and look at the various criteria that I've talked about. So is the assignment long-term, short-term? Is there flexibility, etc.? So looking at all the criteria that I've spoken about. So I think it's fairly arbitrary to say that after 100 days work, then the hirer will start deducting PAYE. I don't think that's the right approach at all. So, and the answer is it's not contrary to employment law. This is employment tax law. So you have to use the principles laid down in the employment law cases to try and reach a decision on the status of the individual. Someone else says, we're a large multi-academy trust. You only have to carry out a status determination statement once for supply agencies providing cover teachers. Now, the answer is you're meant to undertake the status determination statement for each assignment. Someone else has asked, I don't take a salary from my company as I have other PAYE employment. How can they take my tax by employment, as they're effectively taxing the company, not the individual. As I was saying, IR35 is about employment tax, and the obligation is on the hirer to determine whether the assignment is caught by the IR35 rules or not. And if the assignment is caught, then the hirer, I'm afraid, is obliged to make those PAYE deductions from the payments that they are making to the personal service company. So the personal service company will lose out, and ultimately the individual. Someone else asked, we conduct IR35 assessment centrally. Do you have an assessment form that could be completed by a contractor, engaging a manager to help? I mean, we do essentially in the team have various precedents that we work with and take into account all of the criteria that I've talked about. But again, if you want to contact me direct, please do so. Someone else has asked, what is the definition of a personal service company? Well, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Personal service company is essentially, for the purposes of IR35, an intermediary that is used by an individual to contract, rather than either going through an umbrella or contracting themselves as an individual. So I think, to be honest with you, that's all we've got time for. Any other questions I will deal afterwards, but thank you for listening. And if you have any queries, please don't hesitate to email me direct.